If you dare to explore the darkest mysteries, subscribe now to Whispers in the Dark. Activate notifications and be prepared to hear whispers that may haunt you even in the silence of the night. Real stories, mysterious events, and spine-chilling tales. But beware, fear will always be your companion here. Click the subscribe button before it's too late. Christmas Eve Intruder. It started around 8 p.m. on Christmas Eve. We had just finished dinner, and the house felt warm and cozy. The tree lights were twinkling, and the faint sound of a Christmas playlist played in the background while we lounged in the living room. My mom was sipping her tea, my dad was flipping through a movie guide, and my younger brother was on the floor playing with his new Lego set. Everything felt normal until we heard it, the loud, deliberate banging on the front door. Not knocking, but banging, like whoever was out there was either desperate or angry. At first, we all froze. It wasn't the kind of night you'd expect visitors, and nobody we knew would pound on the door like that. My dad stood up slowly, his expression tense. "Who is it?" he called out, his voice steady but cautious. There was no response, just another round of pounding, even harder this time. My mom grabbed her phone and whispered, "Should I call someone?" My dad motioned for her to wait. Finally, a man's voice shouted through the door, "I'm looking for Sandra. I know she's in there." We didn't know any Sandra. My dad glanced at us, confused, then stepped closer to the door and yelled back, "There's no Sandra here." The man didn't seem to believe us. He kept banging on the door harder and harder, and shouting, "Don't lie to me. I know she's in there. Open the door." His voice was rough, almost panicked, but there was something menacing about it too. My mom was visibly shaking at this point, clutching her phone like a lifeline. My brother crawled up onto the couch next to me, and I tried to act calm for his sake, but my heart was racing. My dad told us to stay put and went to the front window, trying to sneak a look without being obvious. I could hear him muttering, "Who the hell is this guy?" under his breath. When my dad peeked through the curtains, he froze. "He's right up against the door," he whispered. "I can't see his face, but he's big." Then, as if the guy knew my dad was watching, he stepped back suddenly and looked straight at the window. My dad jumped back like he'd been burned. The man started yelling again, "Sandra, I'm not leaving. You can't hide from me forever." That's when my mom finally dialed 911, her hands trembling so much she almost dropped the phone. She whispered into the receiver, explaining the situation, and I could hear the dispatcher telling her to stay calm and that officers were on the way. The banging stopped for a moment, and we all held our breath, thinking maybe he had left. But then came a terrifying sound, the doorknob rattling, like he was trying to open it. My dad yelled through the door, "Leave now. The police are coming." But the man didn't respond. Instead, he started slamming his shoulder against the door, making the whole frame shudder. My mom was practically crying by then, trying to stay quiet while the dispatcher kept her on the line. My brother buried his face in my arm, and I just sat there, frozen, listening to every thud against the door. Then we heard something that made my stomach drop, the sound of glass breaking. It came from the side of the house, near the kitchen window. My dad ran toward the noise, yelling for us to lock ourselves in the bathroom. My mom grabbed my brother and dragged him down the hall, but I couldn't move. I just sat there, staring at the front door, half expecting it to burst open at any second. That's when I saw something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow moving past the living room window. He wasn't at the front door anymore. He was circling the house. The next few minutes felt like hours. My dad came back from the kitchen, his face pale. He said the window was cracked but not completely broken, and there was no sign of the man. Still, we knew he was out there somewhere. My mom stayed huddled with my brother in the bathroom, but I refused to leave the living room. I felt like if I stayed where I could see the front door, I'd know what was coming. My dad whispered, "The police will be here soon. Just stay calm." But calm wasn't an option when you could hear footsteps crunching through the snow outside. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, everything was quiet again. Then, out of nowhere, there was a loud metallic crash, like someone had thrown something against the side of the house. My dad cursed under his breath and grabbed a heavy lamp from the side table, holding it like a weapon. That's when we heard the man's voice again, but this time it sounded farther away. "You can't hide her forever," he yelled. "Tell her I'll be back." His words sent chills through me, but what really got me was the sound of his footsteps fading into the distance. He was leaving, but not because of us. It felt like he'd decided something on his own, something we couldn't understand. We didn't move until we heard the police sirens. Even then, my dad waited by the window until the red and blue lights lit up the driveway. 2 officers came to the door, and my dad let them in, explaining everything while they checked the house and yard. One of them found footprints in the snow leading from the front door to the side of the house, then around to the backyard and out toward the street. The officer shook his head and said, "This guy was persistent. You're lucky he didn't break in." That thought alone made my stomach churn. As they questioned us, my mom mentioned something about Sandra, the name the man had been shouting. That's when one of the officers asked, "Is that the new neighbor's name?" We all looked at each other, confused. Our new neighbor had just moved in a week ago, and none of us had met her yet. The officer nodded grimly and said, "Sandra's her ex. We've dealt with him before. He's unhinged." My dad demanded to know why this guy thought Sandra was in our house, but the officer just shrugged. He probably saw her move in next door and got confused. But you should be on alert. If he thought this was her house, he might come back. The officers stayed for a while, patrolling the area and assuring us they'd keep an eye out for the guy. They suggested we double-check our locks and keep our lights on overnight, just in case. Even after they left, none of us felt safe. My dad stayed up by the window, keeping watch, while my mom tried to calm my brother, who was still shaking and asking, "What if he comes back?" I didn't have an answer for him. Every little sound outside made my heart race, even though I knew the police had probably scared him off. The weirdest part? The next day, Christmas morning, we saw our new neighbor for the first time. She was outside, shoveling snow from her driveway, and looked completely normal, like someone you'd see at the grocery store or in line at the bank. My dad went over to check on her and casually mentioned the man from last night. Her face went pale, and she muttered, "That's my ex. I told the cops he might follow me here." My dad was furious. "And you didn't think to warn anyone?" he asked. She just shook her head and apologized, saying she didn't think he'd bother anyone else. But the look in her eyes told a different story. She wasn't just sorry. She was scared, too. After that, things seemed to settle down, but the uneasiness never really left. We all started noticing small things. A noise in the yard that turned out to be nothing. Shadows in the corner of our eyes that disappeared when we looked again. It was like the man had left a piece of his fear behind, even though we never saw him again. My dad bought extra locks for the doors, and my mom insisted on keeping the curtains shut at night. I found myself checking the front door constantly, even in the middle of the day. A week later, the new neighbor moved out. Just like that, gone. No notice, no goodbyes. One morning, a moving truck pulled up, and by that evening, her house was dark and empty. My mom said it was probably for the best, but it left us with even more questions. What had happened between her and her ex to make him so desperate? And why had she moved in only to leave so suddenly? To this day, I can't shake the memory of that man's voice, full of anger and something else I still can't put my finger on. Whatever it was, I'm just glad he never came back, at least, not for us. break-in and threats. I was 22 when it happened, fresh out of college and living at home with my younger siblings, Mia and Josh. Our parents were traveling for work that summer, so it was just the three of us in the house, a cozy two-story in a quiet suburban neighborhood. We had a system in place. I handled groceries and meals, Mia took care of the cleaning, and Josh, being the youngest at 14, got away with mostly mowing the lawn and walking our dog, Benny. Life was peaceful, almost boring, in that predictable suburban way. I just started a remote job, so most of my days were spent typing away in the living room while Josh played video games upstairs and Mia blasted music in her room. That night, though, something felt off. Benny, usually lazy and content to sleep near my feet, kept pacing by the front door, growling low under his breath. I chalked it up to a squirrel outside, but now I wonder if he sensed what was about to happen. It was around 11:30 p.m. when we heard the first noise, a faint but deliberate rattling at the back door. At first, I thought it might be the wind, but then came the sound of glass breaking, sharp and clear, echoing through the quiet house. I froze mid-step, my heart thudding as I locked eyes with Mia, who had just come out of her room. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her face pale. Josh appeared at the top of the stairs, his headset dangling around his neck, asking what was going on. I gestured for him to come down quietly, adrenaline kicking in as I grabbed my phone. My hands shook as I dialed 911, whispering to the operator that someone was breaking in. Before I could say much, Benny let out a ferocious bark, and a deep, guttural voice from outside cut through the noise. "I know you're in there. Come out, or I'll make you." Mia clutched my arm so tightly I could feel her nails digging into my skin. "What do we do?" she mouthed, her eyes darting toward the back of the house. The operator was still on the line, telling me to stay calm, but my mind was racing. I motioned for Josh to grab Benny and hide upstairs, but before he could move, the back door flew open with a loud crash. I swear my heart nearly stopped. A man stepped inside. A big guy, probably in his late 30s, with a scruffy beard and eyes that glinted like he enjoyed the fear he was causing. He didn't look like some random thief. His movements were too calculated, too confident, like he knew exactly what he wanted. I whispered to the operator what was happening, praying she could hear me over Benny's barking. "Stay upstairs," I hissed to Josh, but the man must have heard me. He smiled, a cold, awful smile, and pointed at the staircase. "If anyone tries to hide, I'll find them," he growled. He was holding something in his hand. At first, I thought it was a flashlight, but as he stepped closer, I saw the glint of metal. A knife. My body went cold. I could feel Mia trembling next to me, and I realized we couldn't wait for the cops to get there. We had to do something. Benny, our saving grace, lunged at the guy, snapping and barking like crazy. It gave us just enough of a distraction. "Run!" I screamed at Mia and Josh, shoving them toward the front door while Benny kept him occupied. We bolted out the front door barefoot, the cold pavement biting at my feet as we sprinted down the street. I didn't stop to look back, but I could hear the man shouting inside, cursing at Benny. My chest burned, my breath coming in sharp, panicked gasps. Mia was crying, clutching Josh's hand as we ran. All I could think about was getting them to safety. A few houses down, I spotted a porch light still on and banged on the door, yelling for help. An older man opened it, his face a mix of confusion and concern. "Please, call the police," I begged, barely able to get the words out. He ushered us inside, locking the door behind us, and grabbed his phone. I glanced back toward our house, half expecting to see the man following us, but the street was eerily empty. Minutes felt like hours as we waited. I held Josh and Mia close, trying to calm them, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking. Finally, the flashing red and blue lights cut through the darkness. I ran outside as two officers approached, struggling to explain everything that had just happened. They moved quickly toward the house while another officer stayed behind to question us. I remember stammering, "He's got a knife, and my dog is in there." The officer nodded, speaking into his radio, but the pit in my stomach only grew. What if they were too late? Benny wasn't just a dog, he was family. When the officers returned, their faces were grim. The man was gone. He'd smashed through the sliding glass door in the back and disappeared into the night. Benny was okay, though, limping but wagging his tail when they brought him out. The police stayed for hours, combing through the house and asking endless questions. They took pictures of the broken glass, the muddy footprints on the carpet, and the knife he'd left behind, a cheap but nasty-looking thing with a serrated edge. I could barely focus on their questions. My mind kept replaying the man's voice, that horrible smile, the way he'd seemed so sure of himself. Why us? What did he want? The officer said he was likely a drifter, someone looking for an easy target, but something about the whole thing didn't sit right with me. The way he called out to us, like he knew we were there, like he'd been watching. That thought alone made my skin crawl. The next few nights were awful. None of us could sleep. Every creak of the house felt like a warning. Every shadow on the wall made my heart race. Benny refused to leave my side, growling at nothing more than the sound of wind against the windows. I tried to act strong for Josh and Mia, telling them we were safe now, but deep down, I wasn't so sure. The cops hadn't found him, and the thought of him still out there made my stomach turn. Then, 3 days later, it got worse. I came home from running errands to find the words, "You're mine," scratched into the paint on the front door. My knees buckled, and I almost dropped the bags I was carrying. I backed away, heart hammering, and called the police again. The officers came quickly, but their faces were tired, almost dismissive. One of them, a younger guy with a thick mustache, tried to reassure me. "It's probably just some kids messing around," he said, running a hand over the scratches. But I knew it wasn't. The letters were jagged, uneven, carved with the same deliberation I'd seen in that man's movements the night he broke in. I told them about the break-in again, my voice rising as I tried to make them understand this wasn't random. "He's watching us," I said, but the older officer just sighed. "We'll add it to the report," he muttered. That was the last straw for me. I called my parents, begging them to come home early. They promised to book a flight the next morning, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we wouldn't make it through another night without something happening. That evening, I barricaded the doors with furniture and made Mia and Josh sleep in my room. Benny curled up at the foot of the bed, his ears twitching at every sound. I sat up late, clutching a heavy flashlight like a lifeline. At around 2 a.m., just as I was starting to drift off, I heard it, the faint crunch of footsteps outside the window. My blood ran cold. I reached for my phone with trembling hands and called 911 again, whispering to the operator that someone was outside. She stayed on the line, telling me to stay quiet and not engage. Then came the tapping, slow, deliberate, on the bedroom window. A sick, mocking rhythm that made my heart feel like it was going to explode. I didn't dare move, barely breathing as I stared at the thin curtain covering the glass. And then he spoke. His voice was low and taunting, just like that night in the house. "You can't hide forever," he said, drawing out the words like he was savoring them. My hand clamped over Mia's mouth as she started to whimper, and Josh curled into a ball beside me, his eyes wide with terror. Benny was growling, low and steady, but even he didn't make a move. I could hear the man pacing just outside, his footsteps crunching on the gravel, circling the house like a predator. "You're mine," he repeated, almost like a chant, before slamming something against the window. The sound of cracking glass made me flinch, and I was certain he was coming in this time. The operator assured me the police were on their way, but seconds felt like hours. Then, Benny did something I'll never forget. He leapt off the bed and lunged at the window, barking and snarling like I'd never seen before. The sound was feral, primal, and it startled the man enough to make him stop. For a moment, there was silence, and then the footsteps retreated. I stayed frozen, clutching Mia and Josh, until I finally saw the flashing lights of a patrol car. The officers searched the area but found nothing. No man, no footprints, just the shallow scratch marks on the window where he'd hit it. The police stayed until dawn, patrolling the neighborhood and assuring me they'd increase surveillance in the area. But their reassurances felt hollow. I kept replaying his voice, the tapping, and the way he seemed to know exactly where we were. That morning, I made a decision. I wasn't waiting around to see what he'd do next. My parents were still hours away from getting home, so I packed a few bags, loaded Josh, Mia, and Benny into the car, and drove to a motel on the other side of town. I didn't even tell the police where we were going. I figured the fewer people knew, the safer we'd be. The motel wasn't much, a dingy room with faded wallpaper and a faint smell of mildew, but it felt like a fortress compared to the house. For the first time in days, we all managed to sleep, though I kept the chair propped against the door handle and Benny at my side. When my parents arrived later that afternoon, I broke down telling them everything: the break-in, the scratches, the voice at the window. My dad immediately called a security company, and by the next day, the house was outfitted with cameras, motion lights, and reinforced locks. We even got an alarm system that connected directly to the local police station. It felt like overkill, but I didn't care. I just wanted us to feel safe again. Over the next few weeks, things slowly started to feel normal again. The cameras never picked up anything unusual, and there were no more scratches, no voices, no signs of him at all. The police kept the case open but admitted there wasn't much they could do without identifying him. Even though he hadn't come back, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, waiting for the right moment. I started sleeping with a pocket knife under my pillow and kept my phone within reach at all times. One day, though, we got a call that gave me some closure. The police told us they'd arrested a man matching the description I'd given, caught breaking into another house across town. He had a history of stalking and harassment, and when they searched his belongings, they found a notebook filled with unsettling details about his victims, including a page with our address scrawled on it. I felt a mix of relief and dread knowing how close he'd come to doing something worse. He was charged with multiple counts of breaking and entering, and though I don't know how long he'll stay behind bars, I hope it's enough to keep him away. Even now, years later, I still double-check locks and jump at strange noises in the night. But I try not to let the fear control me anymore. What I do know is that Benny saved us that night. If he hadn't been there to scare the guy off, I don't know how things might have ended. He's older now, his muzzle gray and his movements slower, but I spoil him every chance I get. After all, he's more than a dog, he's a hero. Marina predator. I grew up on a small boat, docked in a quiet marina off the Gulf Coast. It wasn't as glamorous as people think. Living on a boat is cramped, and privacy is rare. My dad worked odd hours at a fishing charter, so I spent most afternoons alone, wandering the dock or reading in our cabin. The marina felt safe, the kind of place where people left their boats unlocked and greeted each other by name. But that summer, when I was 12, something happened that still haunts me to this day. It started with a man named George. George's boat was parked 2 slips down from ours. He was a heavy-set guy, probably in his 40s, with a permanent sunburn and a voice that carried across the water. My dad thought he was friendly, always cracking jokes and offering beers, but I hated him from the start. There was something about the way he looked at me. His eyes lingered too long, his smiles felt wrong. At first, I thought I was imagining it, until one afternoon when George cornered me on the dock. It was mid-afternoon, and the dock was unusually quiet. Most of the other boat owners were out fishing or running errands, so it was just me, barefoot and bored, skipping stones into the water. I heard George before I saw him. the heavy thud of his boots on the wooden planks. When I turned, he was already too close, grinning like he had some kind of secret. "Hey, kid," he said, leaning down a little. "Where's your old man?" I mumbled something about him being out on a charter and tried to move past him, but George stepped to block my path. His smile didn't budge, but his voice dropped lower. "You're always out here alone, huh? That's not safe. Anything could happen to a kid like you." My stomach knotted up. I tried to laugh it off, to act like I wasn't scared, but my hands were shaking as I shoved them into my pockets. He didn't move for what felt like forever, just staring at me, his grin fading into something darker. Finally, he stepped aside, letting me pass, but as I walked away, I swear I heard him chuckle. After that, I started avoiding George as much as I could. I'd wait until I was sure he wasn't around before going on the dock, and if I saw him coming, I'd duck into the cabin or pretend to be busy with something. But George always seemed to show up when I least expected it, like he was watching me. Once, I caught him sitting on a bench near our boat, smoking a cigarette and staring straight at our cabin window. When I told my dad, he just waved it off, saying, "George is harmless. He's just lonely." But I knew better. The worst came one night when my dad had to work late. I was in the cabin, reading by flashlight because the marina's power lines had been acting up, when I heard footsteps on the deck. At first, I thought it was my dad, but the steps were too slow, too deliberate. My heart started pounding as I crept up to the porthole and peeked out. George was there, standing on our boat, his face pale in the moonlight. He wasn't smiling this time. He looked angry. For a moment, I froze, unsure of what to do. Then I saw his hand move to the cabin door handle, and instinct kicked in. I bolted to the door and shoved the lock into place just as he started twisting the handle. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold the latch steady. "Hey, open up." George's voice came through the thin cabin walls, low and harsh. He jiggled the handle again, harder this time. "I just want to talk." His words sent a cold wave through me. They were calm, too calm, but there was something in his tone that felt like a threat. I didn't respond, hoping he'd think I wasn't there, but then I heard him mutter, "I know you're in there." I backed away from the door, looking around the cabin for something, anything I could use to defend myself. All I found was a rusty boat hook leaning in the corner. I grabbed it, gripping the metal tight, and crouched behind the table. My heart was hammering so loud I was sure he could hear it. For a moment, everything went quiet, and I thought maybe he'd given up. But then the sound of him banging on the door shattered the silence. "Open the damn door," he yelled, his voice no longer calm. That's when I noticed the window. The window was small, just above the sink, but big enough for me to squeeze through if I was careful. I didn't have much time to think it over. George was still pounding on the door, and now the whole boat seemed to shake with each hit. I crawled over to the window and shoved it open, the salty night air hitting me like a slap. My hand slipped on the frame as I hoisted myself up, my bare feet scraping against the edge. Just as I got my torso halfway through, I heard the door splinter behind me. "Where do you think you're going?" George's voice was closer now, and I felt my stomach drop. I scrambled the rest of the way through the window, landing hard on the deck outside. My knees buckled, but I didn't stop. I took off down the dock, my feet slapping against the wet wood, the sound echoing in the stillness of the marina. I didn't look back, but I could hear him following me, his boots thudding heavier and faster. The boat slips blurred together as I ran, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I didn't stop running until I reached the marina office at the far end of the dock. The door was locked, the building dark except for a faint glow from a desk lamp inside. I banged on the glass, shouting for help, but no one answered. My chest felt tight, panic clawing at my throat. Behind me, I could hear George's boots growing louder, closer. In a last-ditch effort, I ducked behind a stack of crates near the office, pressing myself against the damp wood and praying he wouldn't find me. I could hear him breathing now, heavy and uneven, as he stopped near the office door. "You think this is a game, huh?" he hissed, his voice cutting through the night like a knife. I held my breath, my whole body trembling as his footsteps crept closer to where I was hiding. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, the sound of his boots shifting on the dock making my skin crawl. Then, out of nowhere, I heard another voice, a sharp, angry bark. "Hey, what the hell are you doing?" The new voice belonged to one of the marina's night guards, a gruff older guy named Earl who I'd seen around a few times. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, landing square on George. I peeked out from behind the crates and saw George freeze, his whole demeanor shifting. The anger drained from his face, replaced by an awkward grin. "Oh, hey, Earl," he said, raising his hands like he'd been caught doing something harmless. "Just looking for my keys. Think the kid might have seen them." Earl wasn't buying it. "You've got no damn business being on someone else's boat, George," he snapped, moving closer. "Get the hell out of here before I call the cops." George hesitated, glancing around like he was weighing his options, but then he gave this little shrug and started backing away. All right, he muttered, holding up his hands like it was no big deal. He turned and walked off, but not before shooting one last look in my direction, his eyes narrowing in a way that made my stomach turn. After George disappeared into the shadows, Earl walked over to me, his flashlight beam bouncing off the crates. "You all right, kid?" he asked, his voice softer now. I nodded, though my whole body was shaking. I tried to explain what had happened, but the words came out jumbled, and I could barely make sense of them myself. Earl frowned, his face hardening as he listened. "That guy's bad news," he muttered, more to himself than to me. "I'll make sure he doesn't come back." He stayed with me until my dad got home, and for the first time that night, I felt a little bit safe. But things didn't just go back to normal. The next day, George's boat was gone. No one had seen him leave, and he didn't tell anyone he was going. My dad thought it was odd, but he brushed it off as George just skipping out on his dock fees or something. For me, it was a relief. Still, every time I walked down the dock after that, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. It's been years since that night, but I still think about George. I don't know what he was planning, but I know one thing for sure: I was lucky to get away. Thanksgiving weekend stalker. Thanksgiving weekend has always been a big deal for me and my mom. We don't go overboard with Black Friday shopping, but we have this little tradition of heading out early Saturday morning to browse the deals that are left and grab a festive coffee from our favorite cafe. This happened a couple of years ago, and honestly, I still can't shake the feeling it left me with. At the time, I was 26, recently out of a long-term relationship, and back living with my mom temporarily. She's always been my rock, kind but no nonsense, with this sharp intuition I've learned never to doubt. That morning, we'd left the house around 8 a.m., laughing about how ridiculous some of the Black Friday madness we'd seen on TV was. The first store we hit was a big box retailer about 20 minutes away. The parking lot was packed, but the vibe was cheery. We grabbed a cart, wandering aimlessly through the aisles, joking about how neither of us needed half the stuff we were looking at. It wasn't until we were in the home goods section, debating over some throw pillows, that I noticed him. A man, average height, maybe mid-40s, wearing a worn-out leather jacket and a baseball cap, standing at the end of the aisle, staring. At first, I thought he was just waiting for someone, but something about his posture was off. He wasn't browsing, not even pretending to. He was just there, watching. I nudged my mom, trying to be subtle. "Hey, don't look now, but I think that guy's been watching us." She glanced up, her expression barely changing, but I could tell she noticed him too. "Let's head to another section," she said casually, steering the cart toward the kitchenware. I thought that would be the end of it, but when I glanced over my shoulder a few minutes later, he was there again, standing a few aisles away, pretending to look at a shelf of coffee makers. My stomach twisted. I told myself it was just a coincidence. Stores are crowded during the holidays, but my mom's lips were pressed into a tight line, and I could tell she was on high alert. We decided to leave the store, figuring a change of scenery might shake him off if he was actually following us. As we walked toward the exit, I noticed him again, this time by the electronics section, moving in the same direction. My heart started racing. My mom grabbed my arm as we reached the parking lot. "Let's head to the car," she said firmly, her voice low. The thing is, we didn't head to our car right away. Instead, we walked past it, heading for a row farther down. I didn't question her at the time, but later I realized she was testing to see if he'd follow us. And he did. My mom's grip on my arm tightened as we turned down another row of cars, this one almost empty. The man's pace quickened behind us, his footsteps crunching on the frost-tipped pavement. "Don't look back," my mom muttered, her voice steady but tense. My heart was pounding so loud it felt like the sound would give us away. We stopped at the trunk of a random SUV, pretending to search for keys. He stopped too, just a few cars behind, leaning casually against a minivan. Except there was nothing casual about the way he stared. I could feel his eyes burning into us. After a few agonizing seconds, my mom grabbed my hand and said loud enough for him to hear, "I forgot something inside. Let's go back." We marched back toward the store, her steps quick and purposeful. I risked a glance behind us and saw him hesitate, then start walking in the same direction. It was like a game of chicken. He was close enough to make his presence known, but far enough that he could still play it off if anyone questioned him. I felt sick. My mom nudged me toward the customer service desk when we got inside. "Ask for security," she whispered. "I'll stay here and keep an eye on him." I darted to the customer service desk, trying to keep my voice steady as I explained the situation. The woman behind the counter, her name tag said Darlene, looked concerned and immediately called for a security guard. She told me to wait there while she paged someone, but I couldn't help glancing back toward where I'd left my mom. She was standing near the entrance, pretending to scroll through her phone, but her eyes kept flicking toward the man. He hadn't gone far. He was lingering near the shopping carts, leaning on one like he was waiting for someone. I caught a glimpse of his face. He wasn't angry or even nervous. He looked amused, like this was all a joke to him. The security guard, a broad-shouldered guy with a gruff voice, arrived within minutes. I explained everything again, my words tumbling out in a rush. He nodded, calm and professional, and asked me to point the man out. When I turned back to the entrance, my stomach dropped. He wasn't there anymore. My mom was standing alone, her expression unreadable. I hurried over, the guard following close behind. "He left," my mom said quietly, glancing toward the parking lot. "He was watching me, and then he just walked out. But I don't think he's gone." The security guard escorted us to the parking lot, walking slightly ahead, his hand resting near his belt like he was ready for anything. My mom and I stayed close together, and I swear I could feel every nerve in my body buzzing. The lot seemed so much bigger now, the rows of cars stretching out endlessly, each one a potential hiding spot. We made our way to our car, scanning the area, but there was no sign of him. Just as I started to think maybe he had left for good, I caught a flicker of movement a few rows over. There he was, leaning against a dark sedan, his arms crossed, staring directly at us. He wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. "There," I hissed, pointing him out to the guard. The man didn't flinch, didn't move, even as the guard started walking toward him. My mom tugged on my arm. "Get in the car," she whispered sharply. The guard called out, "Hey you, stay where you are." The man turned and started walking away, his movements slow and deliberate, like he wanted us to know he wasn't in any rush. He rounded the corner of the lot, disappearing between two buildings. The guard jogged after him, motioning for us to stay put. My mom and I climbed into the car, locking the doors immediately. I was shaking so badly that I dropped the keys trying to start the engine. "Take a deep breath," my mom said, her voice steadier than I expected. She was gripping the steering wheel so hard her knuckles were white. I finally managed to start the car, but we didn't move. Instead, we waited, eyes darting between the parking lot and the narrow alley the man had disappeared into. Every second felt like an hour. After a few minutes, the guard returned, shaking his head. "He's gone," he said, leaning down to talk through the cracked window. I followed him down the alley, but it leads to a main road. He must have gotten into another car or slipped away on foot. His calm tone didn't help. My chest was tight with unease. "Do you want me to call the police?" he asked. My mom glanced at me, her jaw set. "We're leaving," she said firmly. "Thank you for your help, but I don't think sticking around here is a good idea." The guard nodded, but his furrowed brow told me he wasn't entirely convinced. We pulled out of the parking lot, the tension in the car so thick it was suffocating. My mom kept checking the rearview mirror, her lips pressed into a tight line. "Do you think he's still around?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't answer right away, her eyes flicking between the road and the mirrors. "I don't know," she said finally, "but I've got a bad feeling about this. Let's take a different route home." That wasn't like her. My mom wasn't the paranoid type. If anything, she was the one who always told me to stop overthinking things. But now, she was gripping the wheel like we were being chased. We drove in silence for about 10 minutes, weaving through side streets and back roads. I kept looking out the window, half expecting to see his car or his figure lurking on a corner. Then, just as we turned onto a quieter stretch of road, my mom's hand flew to my arm. "There," she said, her voice tight. A dark sedan was behind us, a few car lengths back. It was hard to tell in the fading light, but I was sure it was the same one the man had been leaning against in the parking lot. "Is it him?" I asked, my throat dry. My mom didn't answer. She just pressed down on the gas, her eyes darting to the rear-view mirror. The sedan stayed with us, keeping a steady distance but matching every turn we made. My mom tried to shake him, weaving through side streets and making sharp turns that even I didn't see coming. Each time, though, the car reappeared, creeping into view like a shadow we couldn't outrun. "He's not just following us," my mom muttered under her breath. "He's toying with us." Her calm was unraveling, and that scared me more than anything else. I fumbled for my phone, my hands trembling as I pulled up the keypad. "I'm calling the cops," I said, my voice shaking. Before I could hit call, the sedan suddenly sped up, closing the gap between us. Its headlights flooded the car, so bright it was blinding. My mom cursed under her breath and swerved into a narrow side road, her knuckles white on the wheel. The sedan hesitated, slowing just long enough to make me think we'd lost him. But when we hit the next intersection, there he was, barreling toward us from the other direction. "He's trying to corner us," I yelled, panic bubbling up in my chest. My mom slammed on the brakes and threw the car into reverse, backing down the street as fast as she could. The tires screeched as my mom backed into a side street, her breath coming out in short, sharp bursts. The sedan slowed but didn't follow us this time, lingering at the intersection like it was waiting for something. "He's playing games," my mom muttered, her voice taut with anger and fear. "We're not going to wait around for his next move." She gunned the engine, turning down a winding road that led to the outskirts of town. I was glued to the side mirror, half expecting the sedan to come roaring after us. But it didn't. We drove for what felt like forever, eventually pulling into a well-lit gas station. My mom parked close to the entrance and shut off the car, her hands shaking as she gripped the keys. "Stay here," she said, but I grabbed her arm before she could get out. "What if he's still out there?" She hesitated, scanning the lot like she was expecting him to appear from the shadows. "We need to be around people," she said finally. We went inside together, the fluorescent lights making the whole place feel sterile and too bright. The attendant gave us a curious look, but neither of us explained. We just stood there, trying to catch our breath. After a few minutes, my mom decided we couldn't sit there forever. She bought a couple of water bottles, and we walked back to the car, checking the parking lot one last time. It was empty except for a minivan near the pumps and a lone pickup by the entrance. The sedan was nowhere to be seen. "Maybe he gave up," I said, though I didn't really believe it. My mom didn't respond. She just nodded toward the car, and we got in, locking the doors immediately. She drove back toward home, sticking to main roads this time, where there were plenty of cars and streetlights. When we finally pulled into our driveway, I felt a wave of relief. My mom kept the engine running for a second, scanning the street through the rear-view mirror. "I'll check the door," she said, her voice clipped. I waited in the car while she unlocked the front door and peeked inside. Then she waved me in, and we locked up tight behind us. For the first time all night, the house felt like a safe haven. But as I sat down on the couch, trying to calm my nerves, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd only narrowly escaped something much worse. The next morning, my mom went out to check the mailbox. When she came back inside, her face was pale. She handed me a piece of paper folded in half. I opened it with trembling hands. The words written in jagged black letters sent chills down my spine. "Nice try."